Imagine you are in charge of an entire army, thousands of soldiers, mountains of weapons, ships, cannons, horses, the whole thing. And somehow, in front of everyone, you lose to basically nothing. That sounds impossible, but it actually happened, more than once in American history. And the most embarrassing one? Nobody talks about it, because it is so bad that the people who lived through it spent the rest of their lives pretending it never happened. This is the story of the most humiliating military disaster America ever created. And the wild part is, the enemy barely had to do anything. It starts in 1814. The War of 1812 is still going. America and Britain have been fighting for 2 years. The fighting has been messy and confusing, the way most wars are when nobody is really winning. But then the British get a new idea. Instead of fighting out on the edges, why not go straight to the middle? Why not sail right up to the American capital and burn it to the ground? The British send a small force, around 4,000 soldiers. That is not a huge army. That is not some unstoppable wave of destruction. 4,000 people is roughly the size of a large high school, and America has weeks of warning that they are coming. This is where you come in. You are the United States government. You know the British are sailing toward Washington, D.C. You have weeks to prepare. What do? Apparently, not much. The man in charge of defending Washington was a general named William Winder, and here is the first thing you need to know about General Winder. He was not chosen because he was great at fighting. He was chosen because he was the nephew of the governor of Maryland. That is it. That is the reason. Family connection. In 1814, that was often enough. Historian Donald Hickey, who spent decades studying this war, described the American defense of Washington as one of the most poorly organized military efforts in United States history. And when you look at what actually happened, it is hard to argue with him. Winder spent most of his preparation time riding back and forth on a horse, looking at roads, writing confused letters, and asking for more troops that never arrived. The soldiers he did have were mostly militia, regular people who had picked up guns but had almost no training. Some of them had never fired a weapon in a real battle. Some of them had never fired a weapon at all. The British, on the other hand, were veterans. Many of them had just finished fighting Napoleon across Europe. These were hardened, experienced soldiers who knew exactly what to do in a fight. And they were walking toward a city defended by people who were essentially showing up for the first time. On the 24th of August, 1814, the two forces met at a place called Bladensburg, Maryland, just a few miles from Washington. This was the moment. This was when America was supposed to hold the line and push the British back. What happened instead became so infamous that historians still call it the Bladensburg Races. The battle lasted about 30 minutes, maybe less. The American militia took one look at the British forces advancing across the bridge, heard the rockets screaming overhead, and ran. Not retreated in an organized military way. Ran, dropped their weapons, turned around, and sprinted away from the battlefield as fast as their legs would carry them. British rockets played a huge role in this. The Congreve rocket was a terrifying weapon at the time. It was loud, it lit up the sky, it made an awful screaming noise, and it flew unpredictably. It was not especially accurate. In fact, British officer George Gleig later wrote in his memoirs that the rockets rarely hit their targets. But they did not have to. The sound and the chaos was enough to break the American lines completely. Researcher and military historian John Latimer wrote that the American militia simply had no framework for absorbing the shock of battle. They had never experienced anything like it. And when the rockets hit, something in their brains made one single decision: leave. So they left, and they kept going. Some American soldiers ran all the way through Washington, through Georgetown, and did not stop for miles. The so-called Bladensburg Races became a permanent mark on the memory of that generation. President James Madison himself was at Bladensburg that day. He watched the battle fall apart in real time. He then had to turn his horse around and flee the capital along with everyone else. The President of the United States, running away from his own city. Back in Washington, a woman named Dolley Madison, the president's wife, was doing the actual important work. She was packing up the White House before the British arrived. She saved important government documents. And most famously, she rescued a large portrait of George Washington that had been bolted to the wall. She had to cut the canvas out of the frame herself to get it out in time. While generals were running, she was doing her job. The British marched into Washington unopposed. They walked through the capital of a nation that had spent 30 minutes defending it. And then they burned it. The Capitol building, the White House, the Treasury, gone, or damaged so badly that rebuilding took years. A small rainstorm later that night actually did more to stop the British than the American military did. A massive storm blew through, put out some of the fires, and created enough chaos that the British eventually decided to leave. Rain won the battle. Rain did more than the army. Now, when you hear this story, your first instinct might be to laugh. And honestly, it is a little funny from a safe distance of 200 years. But historian Nicole Eustace, who wrote about the emotional and political fallout of the War of 1812, points out something important. The real damage was not the burned buildings. Buildings can be rebuilt. The damage was to something harder to fix. It was to the idea that America knew what it was doing. The burning of Washington was a slap across the face of a young nation that was still trying to figure out who it was. America had only existed for about 30 years at that point. It was still new, still fragile in ways that it does not like to admit. And this defeat showed something uncomfortable. Being brave and being prepared are two different things. Wanting to win and actually training to win are two different things. General Winder was eventually investigated by Congress. The investigation concluded that, yes, the defense had been badly mismanaged. Yes, better decisions could have been made, but nobody was seriously punished. The war ended a few months later. Everyone moved on. The burning of Washington got tucked away into the parts of history that people mention briefly and then skip past. But here is the mirror. Here is the part that reflects back onto something you know. Think about every time you have been put in charge of something and you were not ready. A presentation, a project, a moment when someone trusted you and you had not done the work. Think about how you ran through it, hoping speed would replace preparation. Think about how, sometimes, the thing that saved you was not anything you did. It was luck, a rainstorm, a distraction, something else that stepped in at the last second. General Winder did not lose Washington because he was a coward. He lost it because the system that put him there rewarded connections over competence. Because the people above him kept assuming someone else was handling the preparations. Because everyone involved believed, right up until British boots hit American soil, that it probably would not be that bad. It was that bad. The burned walls of the Capitol were rebuilt within a few years. By 1819, the building was back. Tourists can walk through it today without knowing how close it came to permanent ruin. The White House, scorched and gutted, was repaired and repainted. And that coat of white paint, some historians suggest, may be where the name the White House actually came from. So even from disaster, something can grow. Even from a 30-minute defeat, a nation can learn and keep going. Even from the most embarrassing military moment in American history, there is a way forward. You are, after all, living in the rebuilt version of everything that burned that day. And somewhere in that rebuilt version is a lesson that everyone from General Winder to Dolley Madison was trying to teach in very different ways. Do the work before the enemy crosses the bridge, not after. Tonight, when you hear about some organization or government that failed spectacularly at something obvious, remember that this is not a new story. It is the oldest one. And somewhere in 1814, a general on a horse was learning it the hard way, while a woman in the White House was already 3 steps ahead of everyone.